A soldier raises a cup. It contains wine. But not just wine. Something has been dissolved into it. Something that grew in the scrublands of Somalia and Yemen. Something that had been traded across 3,000 miles of desert and sea to reach this exact moment. The man on the cross looks at it and refuses. Mark 15, verse 23. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Most people read that verse and move on. I could not. Because in 2015, a study published in the Journal of Intercultural Ethnopharmacology confirmed something that ancient physicians had known for 3,000 years. Myrrh resin binds to mu-opioid receptors in the human brain, the same receptors targeted by morphine, the same receptors that suppress the sensation of pain. That cup was not a taunt. That cup was an anesthetic, and the people who put myrrh in it knew exactly what they were doing. Here is what nobody tells you about myrrh. It is the only substance in the New Testament that appears at the birth, the death, and the burial of the same man. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns in ancient texts are almost always intentional. The miracle plant, Commiphora myrrha, the myrrh tree. It is a small, thorny, defiantly ugly tree. It grows in the semi-arid scrublands of northern Somalia, southern Ethiopia, and the coastal regions of Yemen. In the ancient world, this territory sat at the far edge of the known trading world. Getting myrrh to Jerusalem was not a matter of walking to the next town. Like frankincense, myrrh bleeds when cut. The resin that seeps from the bark hardens into what are called tears, rough-surfaced, red-brown to yellow-orange. In ancient texts, the color was described as resembling dried blood. That detail mattered more than it might appear. The name myrrh comes from the ancient Semitic root, meaning bitter. In Hebrew, mor, in Arabic, myrrh. Every language that touched this plant named it for the same quality: its taste, its character, its purpose. Bitter things in the ancient world were not considered unpleasant by default. Bitter meant it was medicinal. Bitter meant it was doing something. The Egyptians understood this before anyone else. Their records go back further than almost any other documentation of myrrh's use. And what they used it for tells you everything about why it appears in the New Testament at the moments it does. The Egyptians called it anti. They used it for three distinct purposes: to heal wounds, to preserve bodies, and to mark the passage between worlds: birth, life, and death. The exact same three moments where myrrh appears in the life of Christ. The hidden compound. Now let us talk about what myrrh actually does to a human body. The active compounds in Commiphora myrrha resin belong to two chemical families, furanodiene and terpenoids. The specific compounds include furanodiene, methoxyfuranogermacrine, curzarine, and lindestrine. These are not trace compounds. They make up the dominant active fraction of the resin. In 2015, a study published in the Journal of Intercultural Ethnopharmacology did something that no previous pharmacological study had done with this level of precision. It tested myrrh resin extract against human opioid receptors in a controlled laboratory setting. The result was unambiguous. Myrrh resin binds to mu-opioid receptors. Mu-opioid receptors are the primary targets of morphine, codeine, and most pharmaceutical painkillers currently on the market. When these receptors are activated, the brain reduces the transmission of pain signals. Sensation is dampened. The experience of physical trauma becomes survivable in a way it otherwise would not be. Think about what that means in the context of crucifixion. Crucifixion is not a quick death. Roman historians documented this in clinical detail. It is death by prolonged asphyxiation combined with massive blood loss, combined with the physical trauma of the nails and the weight of the body pulling against the arms. The average time to death was 6 hours, sometimes longer. Every minute of it was conscious. A substance with confirmed mu-opioid receptor binding activity, dissolved in wine and offered to a man undergoing that process, is not a gesture. It is a clinical intervention. The wine was the delivery vehicle. The myrrh was the drug. And somebody at that crucifixion understood this. But the pharmacology of myrrh does not stop at pain suppression. Ancient texts describe myrrh being used to preserve tissue, to clean wounds, to slow infection. Modern pharmacology has confirmed each of these properties separately. Myrrh resin has documented antimicrobial activity against a broad spectrum of bacteria. It has documented anti-inflammatory properties through prostaglandin inhibition, and it has documented wound healing acceleration in vitro studies. The Egyptians were not guessing when they packed myrrh into every wound they treated. They had accumulated 1,500 years of clinical observation before the New Testament was written. They knew exactly what myrrh did. They just did not have the vocabulary of receptor pharmacology to explain why. Close your eyes for a moment and consider this. Every physician in the ancient Mediterranean world, from Egypt to Greece to Rome to Palestine, used myrrh for pain and wound management. It was not folklore. It was the most advanced pain management technology available for 3,000 years. And it was sitting in a cup at the foot of the cross. The ancient evidence. The oldest documented medical use of myrrh sits in a papyrus scroll at the New York Academy of Medicine. It is called the Edwin Smith Papyrus. Scholars date its composition to approximately 1600 BCE, though the medical knowledge it records is thought to be even older. It is the world's oldest known surgical text. And among its case studies documenting the treatment of trauma wounds, it references myrrh, called anti as a topical antiseptic for open injuries. This document was written 1,600 years before the birth of Christ. Myrrh was already an established clinical medicine when Moses was born. Herodotus, writing his histories around 440 BCE, provides the next layer of documentation. He describes the Egyptian embalming process in detail, noting that myrrh, frankincense, and cinnamon were the three essential compounds used to preserve human bodies. In 2001, researchers Sally Buckley and Richard Evershed published a study in Nature, Volume 413, confirming myrrh residue in Egyptian mummy wrappings using gas chromatography mass spectrometry. The ancient Egyptians were not just adding fragrance to their burial rituals. They were applying an antimicrobial tissue-preserving compound that modern chemistry has now fingerprinted in the actual wrappings. Theophrastus, the Greek philosopher and botanist who wrote Historia Plantarum around 300 BCE, documents the geographic origin of myrrh with the precision of a trade analyst. He places the primary Commiphora myrrha groves in the Horn of Africa, specifically the Ogaden region of Somalia, and in the Hadramaut coastal region of Yemen. The journey from those groves to Jerusalem by the 1st century CIE was a well-established commercial route, taxed and controlled at every point. By the time of the New Testament, myrrh had been in continuous medical and ritual use for at least 3,000 years. Everyone who appears in the Gospels handling it was working with a substance that carried the weight of that entire history. It was not an exotic curiosity. It was the most trusted medicine in the ancient world. Now put the three moments together. Matthew 2:11. The Magi arrive at Bethlehem and present three gifts to the infant: gold, frankincense, and myrrh to a newborn baby. Myrrh to a newborn. Why would you bring a painkiller to a birth? There is only one explanation that makes sense from a pharmacological standpoint. The Magi were not selecting gifts at random. They were selecting gifts in accordance with what they believed this child's life would require. A substance for divine presence, a substance for pain, a substance for death. Frankincense for the temple, myrrh for the cross. They brought a medicine for a suffering they had read about in the ancient texts. Now go to Mark 15:23. The cup of wine and myrrh is offered at the crucifixion. He refuses it. For 2,000 years, this verse has been read as a minor detail, a passing note, a moment of cruelty from the soldiers, perhaps, or a fulfillment of prophecy. But if you know what was in that cup, the refusal changes everything. He was offered an opioid analgesic at the moment of maximum physical suffering. He looked at it and said, "No, that is not a minor detail. That is the most deliberate act of the entire crucifixion narrative." He chose to remain fully conscious through every moment of what was happening to him. The painkiller was available. He refused it. Now go to John 19:39. Nicodemus comes to the tomb. He brings a mixture of myrrh and aloes, 75 pounds of it. A standard Jewish burial in the 1st century used between 10 and 15 pounds of spices. Scholars have documented this from both the Mishnah and from excavated burial sites in Jerusalem. Nicodemus brought 5 times the standard amount. That quantity has never been adequately explained by the devotional interpretation. A grieving follower expressing love does not naturally think in terms of 75 pounds. That is a physician's quantity. That is someone who understood the antiseptic and tissue-preserving properties of myrrh at a clinical level and was applying them deliberately. John 3 identifies Nicodemus as a Pharisee and a member of the Jewish ruling council. He was educated, he was wealthy, he had access to medical knowledge that most people in 1st century Palestine did not. And he arrived at that tomb with 5 times the normal quantity of the most powerful antiseptic and preservative compound in the ancient world. The pure intention. So what are we actually looking at here? 3 appearances of myrrh across one life. A gift at birth, an anesthetic at the moment of execution, and a physician's quantity of antiseptic at the burial. The devotional interpretation of these moments is not wrong, but it has always been incomplete, because it treats myrrh as a symbol when the text keeps presenting it as a substance with a function. Consider the people handling it. The Magi were scholars of natural philosophy. They studied astronomical patterns, ancient texts, and the medicinal properties of substances. In the Persian and Babylonian traditions they came from, myrrh's properties were not mystery. They were curriculum. Whoever mixed the cup at the crucifixion understood what they were combining. Wine acts as a solvent for resinous compounds, increasing their bioavailability when consumed. Dissolving myrrh in wine was not accidental. It was the correct preparation method for oral administration of a fat-soluble resin. Someone knew that. Nicodemus, a member of the Sanhedrin educated in both Jewish law and the broader intellectual tradition of the 1st century Roman world, arrived with 75 pounds. He did not arrive with 75 pounds of a substance he did not understand. Isaiah 53:5 describes the suffering servant as wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The prophet was writing about physical suffering in physical terms. The gifts brought to meet that suffering across every moment of the life those prophecies described were physically functional. Gold preserves wealth across time. Frankincense modulates brain chemistry. Myrrh suppresses pain, prevents infection, and preserves tissue. These are not spiritual metaphors dressed as gifts. These are pharmacological tools dressed as offerings. And the people who chose them were literate in both registers simultaneously. He was offered the painkiller. He refused it, which means he knew what it was, which means the people around him knew what it was. The question the text keeps asking, if you read it carefully enough, is not whether these substances had power. The question is who understood that power and what they intended to do with it. So, here is what the investigation concludes. Myrrh is not a burial spice with a symbolic presence at 2 other moments. Myrrh is the thread that runs through the entire story. It appears at birth as a prediction. It appears at the cross as an offer. It appears at the tomb as an application. 3 times. 3 functions. 1 substance. And every single function has now been confirmed by modern pharmacology and archaeological chemistry. The Edwin Smith Papyrus documented its wound-healing properties 1,600 years before the Magi arrived in Bethlehem. The 2015 Journal of Intercultural Ethnopharmacology study confirmed its opioid receptor binding activity 2,000 years after the cup at the cross. Sally Buckley and Richard Evershed found its residue in Egyptian mummy wrappings in 2001, using mass spectrometry on fabric that had waited 3,000 years to be tested. The people who appear in these narratives with myrrh in their hands were not superstitious gift-givers. They were trained observers of the natural world. They knew what this substance did. They chose it deliberately, at every moment. The Bible records the pharmacology. Science is catching up with the record.